Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our four-part series on the 6 days of creation. This is Torah for Non-Jews Academy, and we will have these four-part series quite often on various topics. To begin with, I think it's worthwhile to mention the following points. And the reason why it's important is self-explanatory, as you're going to hear it in the rendition. First of all, as I emphasized and stressed in the introductory class, this is not a religion class. We're not teaching religion. However, and yet, still in all, we need to establish that everything we're going to be teaching, everything we're going to learn, everything we're going to be experiencing is based on the Torah. The Torah that is the Bible, if you may, and that is the teachings of the 5 books of Moses to begin with, and later, of course, the prophets and so on. Now, it's important to understand how Judaism views and approaches the Torah. In other words, what is the Torah? Is it a book of stories? Is it a book of laws? Is it a book of instructions? Is it a book of history? Well, here's the answer. First and foremost, in the Holy Zohar, that is the perhaps most fundamental book of Jewish mysticism, of the foundations of the Kabbalah, written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that is Rabbi Shimon, the son of Yochai, close to 2,000 years ago, who was one of the Tannaic sages. It says over there, Stakel beoraita ubara alma. Literally translated, he, meaning God, looked into the Torah and created the world. In other words, just like a great architect, a great builder, what does he or she do first? They take and they make a blueprint. And based on that blueprint, in which they express all their ideas, all their attentions, their objectives for what they want to make, for what they want to build, based on that, now when you follow that, not only he or she, the actual architect, the actual mastermind of this project, but moreover, those who are going to do the actual implementation of the building, those who are going to follow the steps are going to succeed in accomplishing the person's, the architect's, the master's intentions and objectives. Likewise, Hashem created the world based on what he outlined, based on what he set as his goals, as his intentions in the Holy Torah. And that is what the Torah is. That's number one. Number two, another very important point. The Torah views the human being, the man, we'll call this the man, not as a neutral gender, the man meaning the man or the woman. The Torah views the man as a small world. Think of it. I know it sounds a little bit like Disney. It's a small world after all, but it is. Everything that happens in the macro, meaning everything that happens out there in the big world, really is supposed to become reflected, and in fact does reflect in the life of the small individual human being. And therefore, whatever's written in the Torah, the history of the past, the predictions of the future, all that applies on a communal level for everyone, on an individual level for each and every one, each individual. Another very important point that we should establish, everything, that is absolutely everything, past, present, future, what was, what should be, what is, all that is in the Torah. In other words, think of it. Going back to the previous point, if God made the Torah, and God made the Torah and, quote, looked into the Torah to make the world, then everything that's in the world, everything that happens, everything that's already been discovered or hasn't yet been discovered. Now, this is very important because at times, especially nowadays still, so many varying theories in science. In various science, actually on some level or many levels, make sense. And they have good profound arguments, and sadly, many times, or sometimes at least, don't seem to be consistent with what we know according to the Torah. A classical example: the year, according to the Torah, the year since creation, as if you look at any Jewish calendar, which we obviously count the years in accordance with the Torah, with what we know as factual according to the Torah, is 5,782 years since creation of the world. But science argues otherwise. And there are so many varying arguments if the world is several millions old or hundreds of millions years old, and so on and so forth. And various proofs and various arguments are presented. And some of them perhaps on the surface can make sense. But there will come a day, since everything is indeed in the Torah, there will come a day when we will see a reconciliation between science and Torah. It has to be that there is an absolute alignment. Now it may be concealed, and therefore we have all these arguments, all these varying opinions. But when that all becomes revealed and the truth of the Torah really stands out, then we will see how everything is perfectly aligned, the sciences and the Torah. Another very important point is, of course, that the revelation of Mount Sinai was a one-time only thing. In other words, never again will there be such a revelation, and that's all we have to go with. In other words, we need to follow that which we gleaned, that which we learned beginning with Mount Sinai, all the revelations, all the teachings, including the stories in the Torah which precede Mount Sinai. Remember, we only know them as fact. We only know them as truth because they were told from God to Moses after Mount Sinai in order for him to write them down, in order for him to record it. He served as a scribe, literally, as a secretary, and God was dictating, and he inscribed it in the Holy Torah. So let's begin. We'll begin with the very beginning of the Torah. The very beginning of the Torah, of course, is the 6 days of creation, Genesis. Now, before we even go into what actually took place in these 6 days, what did God create? What did he make? All the details, some of the details which are explicitly mentioned in this Torah, some of the details which are not so explicitly mentioned, and we only know them from the Midrash, which is like the backstory that's been passed down through the oral tradition from generation to generation. But one thing is certain. When you look in the beginning of the Torah, if you recall, I asked the question, what is this book? Is it a book of stories? Is it a book of history? Is it a book of instruction? Well, immediately it begins with stories. It begins with telling us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then how there was darkness, and there was tohu vavohu. There was total chaos. There was nothingness. And how God began to gradually make this world, the universe as we know it, evolve and come into being day by day. The question is, what really is the value of this? In other words, why is God telling this all to us? Is he just a master storyteller? Is this here to entertain us, to give us amusement? Obviously not. In fact, the name of this book, the title of this book, Torah, means what? Well, in the Hebrew, it comes from the Hebrew root word, which means hora'ah, directive. This is a book of lessons. This is a book of instructions. This is a book of directives. This tells us how to live our lives. Sometimes it tells it to us through the means of direct instruction. Do this, don't do that. God says to Moses, do this. God says to Moses, you shall keep this and this precept. But many times, perhaps I can argue most of the times throughout the Torah, it tells it to us by means of a story. In fact, we all know, we've all been to seminars, we've all been to very interesting lectures, and I can say that many of you perhaps would agree with me that in the most part, when you hear a beautiful anecdote, when you hear a nice, intriguing story, and moreover a joke, something that's really amusing, it sticks, it stays with you, it has an effect, and it lingers with you, and it reminds you the lessons. In fact, when you give a direct instruction, perhaps at times it becomes now limited to that instruction. Do this, whatever this is, whatever the details of this, whatever the criteria of that particular precept, and that's it. But when you have a story, when you relate an anecdote, especially one that happened, the things that went right, the things that went wrong, that which was a good outcome, that which led to a not such a good outcome, all that has multifaceted lessons from every whatsoever angle. Moreover, the choice of the details that the Hashem, that is God, the Almighty, chose to share with us in the Torah, also each and every detail gives us an insight, has a whole lesson in itself. Thus, when God is telling us about the creation of the world, what is he really telling us? What does he want to tell us? What message is he trying to convey? So one of the most prominent, if not the absolute forefront in commentaries of the Torah, we all know the Torah is such an important book. This is the textbook of Judaism. This is the textbook of knowledge for all mankind. That's what we're doing here. Has various commentaries on all different levels. I would say the supreme commentary, the most widely accepted commentary that exists, is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, the acronym is known as Rashi, and I would invite you to look it up on Wikipedia or on Google, where have you, for the full history of his life. He lived in Europe, in Worms, and he was, like I said, the supreme commentary on the Torah, the first one to really take the Torah, and then later also the prophets and the scriptures, and in fact, after that, also the Jewish Talmud, which carries all the laws, and he brought it down in an understandable, practical, factual commentary that your common person should be able to read the verses and understand what's going on. Never does he bring us stories. Never does he bring us unnecessary insight. Just what is necessary to understand the verses, to follow and flow along with the narrative that God gives us in his holy Torah. And on the first verse, on the very first words of Genesis, quote, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created. Rashi immediately comments and he says, the great sage Rabbi Yitzchak said that this book, that is the book of the Torah, should have not have begun with this narrative, should not have started with this, with all these stories going through the history, first the creation of the world, and then to the story of Noah, and then to the birth of Abraham, and then to his descendants, all the way to when they descended to Egypt, and until when they leave Egypt, and all the miracles, and only then does it begin to give us the very first commandment, which is the first commandments the Jewish people, the Hebrews, received as a nation while still in Egypt, just few weeks short before the Exodus. Says Rashi, really, the Torah should have begun from there, because this is a book of instruction. This is a book not of stories. This is a book not of history. This is a book of instruction. Why then did God choose to begin from this whole narrative? And the answer is because God was making a very, very strong statement. God was sending us a very important message. And God was telling us, listen here, my dear people. And that is, my dear people from all generations, all people of the world, know that I created the world. I am the boss. It's mine. I gave you the world for safekeeping. I gave you territories. When I say you, I mean this nation, this territory to this nation, and that territory to the other nation, and this parcel of land to this tribe and that parcel of land to that tribe. I am the one who allocated to you. I, by giving it out then, by divvying it out, and I, through my divine providence, over the generations, as countries, as lands change hands, that all comes from me. That is all dictated by me. I am the boss here. I am running the show. I made the show and I am running the show. And why is this so important? Because Rashi explains that there will come a day, and we all know that day came. In fact, that day is happening now, where so many nations of the world will come and say to the Hebrews, to the Jewish people, Listimatem, you are thieves. You stole the land. You took away from these innocent people. You left Egypt and you stole the land. And now in more modern times, you left and you came and you took it away from such innocent people living the land. Says God, I want you to know, this was my land. I made all of the land and I gave it to whomever I wanted to give. I first gave it to them, and then when the time came, and I took it from them and now allocated it for the children of Israel, for the Jewish people. And therefore, no one can tell anyone you are thieves, because for me is the entire land. You see, obviously, some people might argue, well, I don't accept this premise. Well, then we go back to the fundamental argument, who created the world? Who made the world? If we believe what it says in the Torah, which certainly you and I believe what it says in the Torah, that God created the world, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything that's in it, then it's obvious that God had a plan. Of course, one may ask, why then this somewhat injustice of giving it to one people and leading them to believe, or they kind of develop the notion that it belongs to them, that it's theirs, only later to take it from them and give it to his people or to another people? Why would he do that? It seems so cruel. Think of it this way, just as an idea. Think of it. Imagine the people inhabiting Israel would have known all along that this land is not theirs, that this land will not be theirs, and they will not have it for their future generations. Do you think they would have taken care of that land well? Do you think they would have cultivated? Do you think they would have been able to enjoy it? So on the one hand, it may seem still a little somewhat cruel. So God made them foolishly believe that it belongs to them, so that they take care of it, that they safekeep it, that they cultivate the land and make sure that it's there and available, a pristine, fantastic land for the Jewish people. At some level, that also still seems cruel. But think of it this way. All the time that the divine providence, that God's divine will had it so that these people should live there, which was well over 1,000 years, and more than that, well over 2,000 years. All this time that they lived there, if they would have all along known that it's never going to be theirs, that it's not going to be belonging to their descendants, they wouldn't have been able to enjoy it. So in fact, what God did is he did them a favor. Them thinking that it's theirs all along, allow them generation after generation after generation to really enjoy the land. So now we already get a perspective. When God tells us a story, he's not just telling us a story. This is not someone trying to sell a good book. This is not someone trying to make a profit. This is someone who is giving us instruction. This is someone who is teaching us how we should live our lives. And that's why he tells us this beautiful story. A story that enters the heart, enters the mind. Remember what I said. When you hear a story, it gets absorbed. You listen. You hear it. It gets part of you. And therefore, it resonates with you. And it has an effect. And God wanted us to know, at the end of the day, to summarize, I am the boss. I made the world. This is mine. And therefore, what happens in the world, even times that things happen that you don't fully understand why, understand that I have the final word. And certainly I would not do something that doesn't make sense. Certainly I would not do something that's cruel. And if you don't understand at first glance, then look again. Try again. And you may come or perhaps after more looking, you will certainly come to a better understanding, to an appreciation of how God in his infinite wisdom does everything in the most kindest and benevolent of ways. So what does it say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I'm just paraphrasing, the entire universe was all chaotic, and only the Spirit of God is there. And then we come to the first time that the Torah describes how God created the worlds. And what does it say? It says, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or. And God said, let there be light. Now understand, and I think it's quite obvious, as mature adults, we understand that God is not like us, that he is limited to a certain mode of communication in order to express his inner feelings, his inner ideas. You and I, if I want to convey a message to you, I have to verbalize it, or I write it down. Perhaps we even know there's technologies where, God forbid, when people are incapacitated and they cannot even use their mouths to speak because they've been injured or they've suffered some severe disease, some severe illness, that they can even communicate with their eyes and have a computer which has been pre-programmed to allow the computer to understand what the person's saying with the winks of their eyes or with the stare of their eyes through their pupils. But it's still a form of communication. The idea that I'm trying to make is it has to come from inside and it gets expressed to the outside. But here, who was God talking to? Why was he saying things? We know that God's thoughts, even his plans, is already considered action. You and I, when we have a thought, even when we have a plan, it's futile, it's meaningless if we don't implement it, if we don't carry it out. But God, even a thought of God is already a happening. So why then did he have to say it? And why does he have to tell us that he say it? What difference does it make to us that God created it by making it, God created it by thinking it, or God created it by saying it? What difference does it make? Well, the answer is God was trying to tell us something. Perhaps one of the strongest lessons right there in the beginning of the creation. Speech, what you say with your mouth, what you communicate, it has the power to create. Because it has the power to create, at the same time, sadly, it also has the power of the opposite, the power to destruct. It has absolute power. You know, when we were children, we would say, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will not hurt me. Yeah, that is a way of being macho. That's a way of being strong. That's a way of saying, you know what, even if you call me names, even if you try to hurt me, I'm not going to let it penetrate my thick skin. I'm going to let it roll off my back like a duck. It could be it works. Psychologically, maybe, but it's not true. Because when someone says something to us, even if we're the strongest of people, it stings. It hurts. You have yourself sometimes doubting yourself when someone accuses you of something or someone pokes fun at you, even though it's absolutely unfounded and absolutely untrue. What God was telling us, everything a human being says, everything we verbalize has power. Anybody that knows science knows that when you speak a word, that word creates waves. The sound creates waves. Those waves keep on traveling. You no longer see them, and you certainly have no longer any control over them. Once it exits your mouth, it's floating and it's spreading throughout the universe. We have no way of knowing the effect that they have on the universe, but it's like everything else, it's having an effect on the universe. But that's a little in the distance. Let's get closer to one's existence, to one's person. Think of it this way. We say something. Most people say, I didn't really mean it. What God is telling us, man is like God, as we're going to see towards the end of creation, where God is about to create man. And what does he say? Let us make man in our image. Make man in God's image? You want to tell me God has ears? God has a nose? God has a mouth? Absolutely not. God is not limited to those things. So what then does that mean in our image? Well, think about it. In our image means that there's no other creation in the world that has the abilities that man has to create, to destruct. Of course, when we say create, it's more of a borrowed term compared to the ability, to the power that God has to create, because God creates something from nothing. God can create literally whatever he wants. We have the ability to invent. We have the ability to build on what's there. We have an ability to discover what is there hidden within the beautiful powers of the universe that God put in there. That's true. But still, compared to all other creatures in the world, we have powers that are godlike. And that's what God's saying. Vayomer Elohim, and God said, because, and he told us that he said, because he wanted us to know that when you speak, you have the ability to build, and God forbid, when you speak, you also have the ability to tear down. Words could be very, very powerful. I just want to share a few anecdotes, a few examples of this. Number one is a very old tale in the Midrash. It's a long story of a king who was very, very ill. And all the best doctors and healers from the entire world came. Money was no object. And they tried everything to heal him. All the medicine known to them and herbs at that time, but they couldn't succeed. Till finally one unconventional doctor came, a doctor who practiced unconventional medicine, and he said, "Doctor, I have an idea that I know for sure will save your life. The problem is that I don't know how it's possible to make it happen. Just tell me, money is no object." And he said, "If you drink milk from a lioness, you will be healed almost instantly." Now, how do you get a lion to go and squeeze out the milk from a lioness without getting killed, without getting torn into shreds? The king let it be known that whoever is able to bring him 1 pint at least of lion milk will be rewarded with getting half of whatever is in the treasury and in the king's treasures. You know what that means? Becoming one of the richest people in the world. One shepherd showed up at the palace and he volunteered. He was a pretty smart guy and he had an idea. Make a long story short without boring you, he went out into the jungle where the lions are, and he brought with him pieces of meat and delicacies that he knew the lions would like. And with that, he was able to get closer and closer and closer and win their trust until finally he can literally touch the lioness. And as he's feeding it pieces of meat, he nursed the lion into his little sash, and he was on his way back. He succeeded. He has that pint of lioness milk. On the way back, being so exhausted, he decided to take a little nap. And in this nap, suddenly he has a dream. And in his dream, he sees his entire body, his entire being rejoicing. And suddenly a fight breaks out. And each part of his body began to argue with the other. I am the hero. I'm the one who pulled this off. The eyes stepped forward and said, if we couldn't see, you wouldn't get nowhere. Nothing would have happened without us. The brain started laughing. It said, ha, ha, ha. I'm the mastermind of this whole thing. I deserve the greatest credit. Each part of the body argued. The feet came and said, what are you talking about? How would have you gone to that distant stretch of terrain in the wilderness to reach the lions without the ability to walk? And the hands said, big deal. We're the guys who threw the meat. We're the ones that held everything. We're the ones who milked the lioness. And finally, the tongue says, guys, you got it all wrong. I am the most important part of the body. I have all the power. And they all together look at the tongue and they start laughing. They broke out into a roaring, mocking laughter. You? What do you do? Go back. Go back to your space. Go back into the mouth. Be quiet. He didn't tell the lions a story. He didn't tell the lions a good joke. What does it got to do with anything? Okay. He says, you know what? I'll show you. And you will all admit that I am king. Sure enough, he wakes up, and within a few hours he's at the palace. He knocks at the palace gates and he says, here I am. I'm back. I am back with the potion for the king. I am going to save the king's life. Immediately the gates are thrown open. And he comes in and he's brought right before the king. And the king says to him, what do you have for me? And he says to him, I have milk from a kalba. Now a kalba means a dog. And the king became so angry, so infuriated. What? I waited all this time for you to come and mock me while I'm laying on my sick bed. Who knows? Maybe it's my deathbed. And you tell me you brought me milk from a dog? Throw him into prison and we're going to behead him tomorrow. And now he goes from being the hero to sitting on death row. And he starts to cry. And he bemoans his such terrible fortune that just befell him. And he has a dream. And in his dream, he sees again all his body parts, all the limbs, and they're all looking with such sour faces, such sour complexions, with just sadness, and they're looking at each other. They're going to be dead very soon. And suddenly the tongue pipes up and says, so my dear friends, my dear body parts, what says you? Am I the king? And they said to him, yes, you have all the power. You just turned everything around. But how do you get us out of this? He says, I have an idea. Let's go back to the king. And at that moment, he wakes up and he bangs on the cell door. The guard opens up and he says, please, I want you to pass the message to the king that there's a misunderstanding. He misunderstood me. I want to explain. And again, he's brought before the king. This is his last chance. And he says, Your Majesty, I know I used the term kalba, and you understood that to mean a dog. But understand, in our language, that is the shepherds, we have a different slang that we speak. When we say kalba, what we really mean is a young lioness. It's just like a nickname for a lioness. See, in the distance, we all call out to each other kalba so we can come and defend ourselves, that they shouldn't devour our sheep. And that's why I made the mistake. It just came out. Why doesn't Your Majesty try the milk, and you will see that it will do its wonders. And that's what happened. And here you see the power of the tongue. It can change everything from death to life, and God forbid, from life to death. Another beautiful thing is, and I'll bring now from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the leader of the Chabad movement, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who passed away in the summer of 1994, but still his legacy lives on, and in fact is the inspiration for this very series of classes, this whole institute. His inspiration of going out there and teaching everybody the ideals and the beautiful lessons of the Torah. The Rebbe was always very careful in speaking only in a positive manner. The Rebbe always made an emphasis not to say negative words. For example, instead of saying bad, you can say not good. Say, for example, someone once said to the Rebbe, I have a deadline. A deadline has a very negative sounding connotation. It has the word dead in it. Dead is not a good word. Say I have a due date. I have a finish time. but not a deadline. For example, the Jew once came to the Rebbe. He was from the Far East. And he said to the Rebbe, I am from the Far East. And the Rebbe said to him, you are from a place that's not called near. Everything with a positive, everything with a positive spin. But it's not, I'm sorry, I'm misusing the term. It's not a spin, just with positive language, just with positive talk. To give you another story, speaking of the Hasidic Rebbes, the Hasidic masters, we go back close to about 300 years ago. You have the great and holy Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov means the possessor of a good name. He is the founder of the Hasidic movement. Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov had a very close inner circle of disciples, that each and every one of them was a holy, holy man. On their own right, they were all great masters. And of course, they experienced the Torah teachings and the Kabbalah on a whole different level. Once they were in the synagogue and they overheard an argument between two simple Jews. And it got heated, and one said to the other, you know what? I would cut you up like a fish. In that moment, the Baal Shem Tov instructed his students to form a circle by putting their hands over their next fellow's shoulders and forming an unbroken circle, unbroken chain. The two students standing on his either side, he instructed them to put their hands on his shoulders. He put his hands on their shoulders, and suddenly they all started screaming. They actually saw a vision, and they saw a human being chopped up like someone cuts up a salmon, like someone fillets a fish and chops it up. In that moment, he told them to release their hands, and they saw the two individuals standing right on the side of the synagogue, still finishing off their argument. And he said to them, I wanted to show you. I wanted you to experience it. The guy only said a few words. He didn't literally mean that he's going to pull out a big long knife and chop his friend up and have blood and oozing out from all directions. That's not what he meant. But words mean something. And on some level, in so to speak, in the realm of speech, in the realm of thought, and in the realm of speech and expression, that actually happened. It's just that we can't see it. So we don't associate with it too much. We don't give it enough credit. We don't associate with it any power. But really, there's absolute power. There's absolute energy in the words that we say. And this is an important lesson. This is not only the audible words, the words that we verbalize with our mouths. Today we have various platforms, various means of communicating our thoughts, our words. People say, what's the big deal? I just posted it. I just wrote a comment. We have to be very careful. What would that comment do? Where will it reach? What impression would it leave? Am I going to hurt somebody? Am I going to hurt myself by the words that I say? The image that I give off to the words that I say. And now we come to the actual commandment that God made, the actual creation. Vayomer Elokim, and God said, Yehi or, it should be light. What does it mean it should be light? There should be an illumination. Now, what are you thinking when you hear there should be light? Are you thinking incandescent lights? Are you thinking fire? Are you thinking perhaps LED, halogen bulbs? What does he mean by there should be light? And interesting, God creates light, and then he says, there was light, there was darkness, and then it was evening, it was day, one day. So God created light, God created darkness, and then there was evening, and then it was day. What is God teaching us? What is he telling us? In other words, what is the lesson here for us? What is the light and the darkness that God created? What is it? Obviously, it's not the light that we mean, that when we see that it's day or night. It's not only that. It's not limited to that. There's something deeper here. There's a greater meaning here. Think of it in terms of good and evil. Think of it as light and darkness, as the good and the bad that's in the world. God created good, but also God made that there should always be an opposing force. There should always be what seems to be a force negating the light. What is stronger? What did God say that there should be? You see, when we look, especially today in our society, we see that the darkness is so prevalent. The darkness seems to be so overwhelmingly strong. It seems to be so overwhelmingly powerful that who can push away this darkness? Who can fight it? This is where we read the words, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or. And God said, this shall be light. Meaning, the ultimate wish of God, the ultimate desire that God had, is that good should prevail. It's just that he created darkness to give us what is the ultimate gift that man has, and that is free choice. And this we will elaborate on, God willing, in the future classes. Now, if there's any questions or answers, any questions that you may have for our now Q&A session, please put them in the chat, and our host will decide. He will pick the questions that he chooses to be answered, and I will address them. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I guess there are no questions. And we would like to have your input. We'd like to have your feedback. So please, if I can ask you to take a few moments and give us your honest, genuine feedback. Tell us how you like the class. Perhaps if there's things that you dislike, perhaps things that you want to see in the future, perhaps things that you want to hear in the future. Please, by all means, we want this to be a good experience for all of us and for all future viewers, God willing, over the recordings that will remain permanently on the YouTube. So thank you again. Have a good evening. And until next week, I am Rabbi Brashevitsky with the Chabad Jewish Center of Doral. And it was a pleasure and an honor for me to host this class.